What if the most powerful men in history were shaped not by what they said, but by what they never dared to speak? Before the cameras, before the Kremlin, before the West knew his name, there was only a young man, walking cold Soviet corridors, learning how to disappear. His name was Vladimir Putin. But back then, he was just another face in the ranks of the KGB. No one knew what he would become. Not even him. This is not the story of how he rose to power. It's the story of the moment he changed. The moment he learned that silence can be sharper than a bullet. And that fear doesn't live in violence, it lives in the pause before it. In the next few chapters, you won't see military parades or political speeches. You'll witness private lessons, whispered warnings, and reflections too dangerous to share. These are the hidden chapters of a man who built a legacy from shadows. This is the story of the moment he changed forever. First assignment. The air was thick with silence as young Vladimir Putin walked through the stone corridors of the KGB training compound in Leningrad. It was 1975, and outside, a gray drizzle clung to the windows like an omen. Inside, the building smelled of old paper, cold steel, and secrets. Every step echoed with the quiet authority of an institution that trained men not to speak, but to know. At 23 years old, Putin had just completed his initial KGB instruction. He wasn't tall, nor loud, but he had something that many others didn't: presence. Not charisma, something colder. Measured. He looked like someone who was always listening, always calculating. That morning, he had been called into a closed meeting room, no explanation, no warning. Just a sealed envelope with his name on it, and a handwritten note inside. Deliver to Colonel Markov. No detours. No questions. Colonel Sergei Markov was a name people whispered more than they spoke. He had a reputation: ruthless, disciplined, brilliant. Some said he had served in Berlin during the wall's construction. Others believed he'd never left Moscow at all, that he lived inside files and watched everyone from behind smoked glass. The truth didn't matter. The fear did. Putin approached the colonel's office on the third floor. The hallway was narrow, lined with old Soviet posters that preached duty and silence. The walls seemed to lean inward, as if they too listened to every footstep. When he reached the door, his pulse betrayed his composure. He knocked twice. Enter. The voice was sharp, dry, surgical. Putin stepped in. The office was dimly lit, and smelled of cigarette smoke and wet wool. Colonel Markov stood near a window, staring out at the rain-soaked courtyard. "You're early," Markov said without turning. "I was instructed to deliver this without delay," Putin replied, holding out the envelope. Markov took it, opened it slowly, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He read it silently, then folded it and slid it into a folder labeled in red ink, Element 13. "Do you know what this is?" Markov asked. Putin shook his head. "Good. You're not supposed to." He turned to face him. "But I'm going to ask you something that isn't in the manuals. Why are you here?" Putin hesitated. "Because I want to serve the state." Markov smiled faintly. "Everyone says that. But I'll tell you something useful, something they don't print in your textbooks." He took a step closer. "The state is a shadow. It moves when you don't see it. If you want to serve it, you need to become invisible, not loud, not eager. Quiet. Quiet is power." Putin nodded, unsure if he had passed the test or just been warned. "You'll come back tomorrow. Same time. Don't speak to anyone about today." That was it. Dismissed. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. The city felt heavier. Putin walked with slow steps, absorbing every word, every pause. He didn't understand what Element 13 was, or why he was chosen, but he knew something had shifted. This wasn't like university, or judo, or even basic training. This was real. And he had just entered a world where questions were liabilities, and silence was survival. As he crossed the stone courtyard, he caught his reflection in a puddle, distorted, stretched by ripples. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. It was the first time in his life he had felt both essential and replaceable. A part of something larger, darker. And in that moment, Vladimir Putin began to understand what it meant to serve power, not through authority, but through obedience, invisibility, and perfect control. The whisper test. The next morning, Putin arrived 15 minutes early. Not out of nervousness, at least that's what he told himself, but out of discipline. The kind that had been drilled into him at the academy: show up early, speak only when spoken to, and observe everything. That last rule had become a personal mantra. He didn't just enter rooms anymore, he scanned them. He didn't just listen, he memorized. The same corridor awaited him, narrow and silent, with its yellowing walls and faded slogans. The door to Colonel Markov's office was closed this time. He waited precisely until the appointed time, 0800 hours, then knocked twice. Enter. Markov was at his desk, no longer watching the rain. The envelope from the day before was gone, replaced by a slim file with a new red stamp, confidential, L5. He motioned to the chair opposite him. Sit. Putin obeyed. His hands were steady now, his eyes locked in. Whatever anxiety had been present yesterday had calcified overnight into something colder. Focus. Detachment. Markov opened the file and slid it halfway across the desk. Inside were 6 photographs. Each showed a man in a Soviet military uniform. Same rank. Same regiment. Different cities. These men were once trusted, Markov said. Then they weren't. Putin said nothing. I want you to read these names out loud. Slowly. Clearly. He did. One by one. Markov nodded. Now I want you to forget them. Putin blinked. Sir? You heard me. Forget them. You read them, they don't exist anymore. Not to you. Not to anyone. It was a strange command. Impossible, even. But Putin nodded. Understood. Markov leaned forward. This is the whisper test, cadet. The KGB isn't about strength or speed. It's about the whisper you don't repeat. The thought you don't say. The man you never acknowledge existed. He tapped the file. That file will be burned. And so should the memory of it. This is your training now. Memory is a weapon. But sometimes it must be unloaded. Putin's breath caught. It wasn't the message that unnerved him, it was the ease with which it was delivered. Markov's tone was neutral, surgical. The kind you'd use to give instructions for brewing tea or folding a shirt. But these were lives. Real people. Are you uncomfortable? Markov asked. Putin looked up. I'm processing, sir. Good. That's a start. Let me tell you a secret. He stood up, walked around the desk, and stood behind Putin. In this building, you will see many things. Files. Names. Mistakes. Your job is not to judge them. Your job is to learn what happens when people speak too loud, act too fast, or feel too much. There was a pause. You're not a soldier, Vladimir. You're an instrument. And you're being tuned. Putin remained still. There was a strange clarity in Markov's words, something unsettling but undeniably logical. He had always imagined the KGB as a web of missions and codes, not quiet conversations in dark rooms about forgetting people. When Markov finally stepped back behind the desk, he closed the file and pressed a button under his desk. A young clerk entered, took the file silently, and left. No words were exchanged. Markov then looked up. "Tomorrow, you'll observe your first live surveillance. No interference. No questions. Just eyes." Putin stood. Understood. He left the room with a new weight pressing on him, not guilt, not fear, but the realization that identity was fluid here. A person could be erased not with violence, but with silence. And that silence was more effective than any bullet. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, but the city remained gray. He walked along the sidewalk, replaying the names in his head, until they started to blur. He told himself, forget them. And for the first time in his life, he felt what it meant to bury something inside your own mind so deep it could never be retrieved. Not even by yourself. A silent watch. The sun hadn't risen yet when Putin arrived at the surveillance post. It was a small, unmarked apartment on the third floor of a crumbling Soviet-era building. The hallway smelled of damp plaster and boiled cabbage, a scent native to aging Leningrad residences. The door to apartment 3C bore no sign, just a scratched metal plate and a faint outline where a number had once been. He knocked twice, paused, then once again, just as instructed. The door opened a crack. A man with narrow eyes and graying temples gestured him inside without a word. Inside, the apartment had been stripped of any domestic character. No furniture, no curtains, no clutter. Just 2 chairs by a window and a table with a mounted field telephone. On the opposite wall, a thick corkboard was covered in black and white photographs of a balding man with a round face and drooping mustache. He was the subject. Codenamed Sable 9. The handler, Putin still didn't know his name, pointed to the empty chair and placed a pair of headphones on the table. "You listen. You don't speak," the man said flatly. "Not to me. Not to yourself." For the next 6 hours, Putin watched. Across the street, through a narrow window in a cold-looking apartment building, Sable 9 went about his day, reading the newspaper, making tea, pacing slowly from room to room. Occasionally, a visitor would arrive. Each was recorded, times, durations, visible gestures. The headset fed him audio from a concealed bug in the subject's apartment. It was mundane. Complaints about rationing. Whispers of bureaucratic inefficiency. Occasionally, a name would surface, familiar ones from state departments or foreign offices. But nothing treasonous. Not yet. Still, Putin wrote everything down. Every cough. Every pause between words. Every time Sable 9 stirred sugar into his tea. By the 5th hour, the monotony was numbing. Yet it was here, within the boredom, that Putin understood something crucial. Power wasn't in the dramatic. It was in the consistent. The watching. The waiting. At one point, Sable 9 walked to his bookshelf and pulled out a slim blue notebook. He flipped through it, stopped on a page, and muttered a sentence under his breath. Even silence speaks, if you know how to listen. Putin froze. He glanced at the handler, who remained still, staring through the binoculars. Had he heard it too? Later, when the shift ended, the handler spoke again. "You wrote that line down, didn't you?" Putin nodded. "Good. Most trainees miss that kind of thing. They think surveillance is about catching people in the act. It's not. It's about catching them in the thought." That night, back in his own tiny dormitory room, Putin lay awake staring at the ceiling. The line echoed in his mind. Even silence speaks. He thought of the names from the file, the way Markov had spoken of obedience, The way this entire machine ran not on violence, but on anticipation. He thought of his mother's quiet disappointment when he chose state service. Of the worn shoes he'd used for judo practice. Of how he'd always tried to be invisible in school, because being visible meant being a target. And now, being invisible was a weapon. For the first time, Putin felt the gravitational pull of control, not just over others, but over himself. To watch without reacting. To hear without speaking. To exist without leaving traces. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "A man with no shadow is the most dangerous man of all." Then he closed the notebook, turned off the light, and disappeared into the darkness of his own becoming. The assignment that wasn't. It was nearly midnight when the call came. A low buzz on the wall-mounted field phone broke the silence in Putin's quarters. He sat up instantly, fully dressed as if anticipating something. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice, Colonel Markov's, delivered only 3 words. "Report to station." Putin didn't ask which one. He already knew. By 12:30 a.m., he stood inside the shadowy interior of a decommissioned radio facility on the outskirts of Leningrad. The building, half abandoned and lit by dim overhead bulbs, looked more like a forgotten warehouse than a government outpost. He was met by 2 men in civilian coats. One held a briefcase. The other, a revolver in a leather holster. The older of the 2 spoke first. "Tonight is a test. Not of your loyalty, but of your clarity." He opened the briefcase. Inside, a simple manila folder, a photograph clipped to the top, and a set of handwritten instructions. The photograph was of a man, late 40s, thick black glasses, light beard. His name, Yuri Nikitin. Professor. Writer. Occasional radio guest. Suspected foreign contact, the man said. Maybe preparing to leave the country with sensitive notes. Putin studied the photo. "You want him followed?" The man shook his head. "We want him warned." Quietly. Persuasively. That phrasing hung in the air like smoke. "You mean, threatened?" Putin asked, carefully. "We mean spoken to. How you choose your words is your own business." There it was again, the ambiguity, the space between command and conscience. A gap wide enough to slip into, and disappear. "You will go to his apartment. You will wait for him inside. Do not leave a trace." By 1:15 a.m., Putin was standing in Nikitin's darkened living room. The door had not been forced. The apartment was sparse, tidy, decorated with bookshelves and dusty plants. On the desk, a typewriter with half a page of words still exposed. "Truth is a flame that fears only silence." Putin sat down in a chair facing the door. He waited. At 1:38 a.m., the key turned in the lock. Nikitin entered, humming. He didn't notice Putin at first. Only when he turned on the lamp did his eyes widen. Putin didn't move. He simply said, "You need to stop." Nikitin stared at him. "Who are you?" "Someone who reads," Putin replied. "And listens." The man frowned. "Then you've read enough to know that I'm not a threat." Putin stood. "Not yet. But someone thinks you might become one." "Because I speak? Because I write? Because you forget where you live," Putin said coldly. "This isn't a country of maybe." There was a pause. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Nikitin said. "I believe in reform, not rebellion. You should believe in silence." Putin stepped closer. "This is your only warning. No more books. No more talks. No more late-night broadcasts. We won't come a second time." And then he left, without another word. Outside, the wind had picked up. The city looked darker than usual, like it too was holding its breath. Back at the radio station, Markov was waiting. He didn't ask what had happened. "You did as expected?" Putin nodded. "No marks?" "None." "Good. Not everything needs to end in blood to be effective." Markov handed him a small card with a number and a single phrase. "Sometimes, nothing is the action." That night, Putin didn't sleep. He lay awake thinking of the professor's eyes, the tremble in his voice, and the silence that followed. He hadn't touched him. He hadn't threatened him directly. But the message had been delivered. For the first time, Putin understood what it meant to hold fear like a tool, not to use it, but to let others feel its presence, lingering, unsaid. That was power. And he was learning to wield it. The reflection room. 2 weeks passed without a single word from Markov. No summons. No envelopes. No shadowed briefings. Just silence. Putin continued his routine at the training compound, studying, observing, recording. But the silence was louder than any lecture. He felt suspended, as if the system was watching to see what he'd do without being told. That, he realized, was the final part of the test, not action, but patience. Then, on a wet Thursday morning, a courier delivered a note to his room. No envelope this time, just a small, folded piece of paper. Room 17, 0600 hours. Alone. Room 17 was known among cadets as the reflection room. It was an unspoken rite of passage, whispered about like a legend. No one knew exactly what happened inside. Only that those who entered never spoke of it afterward. At precisely 6 a.m., Putin stood before its black steel door. He knocked once. It opened without a sound. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single overhead bulb. A chair faced a full-length mirror mounted to the opposite wall. Nothing else. Inside, already seated, was Colonel Markov. "Close the door," he said. Putin obeyed. Markov gestured to the chair. "Sit." He did. Then silence. For what felt like 10 minutes, they sat. No questions. No instructions. Then Markov spoke, quietly. "What did you learn?" Putin didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the mirror, on his own face, which somehow looked older in this light. Sharper. Less uncertain. "I learned that control starts with silence," he said. "And that fear isn't in the threat, it's in the pause before it." Markov nodded. "And loyalty? It is an obedience. It's trust without needing reason." Markov leaned forward. "And power?" Putin looked at his reflection, eyes narrowing slightly. "Power is the ability to remain unseen, but always present. To know more than you show. To move without noise." Markov smiled for the first time, not a smirk, but something deeper. Approval. "Then you're ready." He stood, walked to the mirror, and pressed his palm to a small panel. With a mechanical click, the mirror slid aside, revealing a narrow hallway lit in red. "No more lectures. No more drills," he said. "From here, you learn through doing." Putin rose. Before stepping into the hallway, he looked one last time at his reflection. His face no longer looked like a student's. It looked like a man who had shed something essential: hesitation, doubt, youth. That hallway, narrow, red-lit, endless, was not just the next step. It was the corridor of transformation. And as he walked into it, Vladimir Putin stopped being a trainee. He became an instrument. He walked in as a cadet. And walked out as something far more dangerous. Not a soldier. Not a leader. But a man who had learned to erase himself. From conversations, from records, even from his own memory. In a world where most screamed to be seen, he discovered the true strength of being invisible. This wasn't the moment he gained power. This was the moment he understood what power really meant. And in that silence, Vladimir Putin was no longer just a name. He had become a system. If this story resonated with you, let us know. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us what hidden chapter you'd like us to explore next. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Hidden Chapters. Because what you don't see is often what changes everything.